Je vais parler plus de l'épistémologie. Mon livre que Philippe a cité, Studying Human Behavior, est publié presque 10 ans. Alors la science se change, se développe, et moi, je, je ne le suis pas. J'ai lu un ou deux ou trois des articles cités par dans le manifeste que le tireur du Buffalo a mentionné. Alors, enfin, je dirais quelque chose qui va connecter ce que je dis maintenant et ce que Philippe a montré, l'histoire dans, dans laquelle nous travaillons intellectuellement. Mais, ok. Apologies. So, what I want to do is give the overall epistemological framework within which I have thought about the relationship between science and values. I think some of what Philippe was talking about, the page partly stuff and the social sciences research consortium work represents a kind of new phase that may require different kinds of responses than some of the responses before. So that's maybe something we can talk about. So let me, and I will skip many slides in the interest of time. Deep or constitutive, takes the social to be a much more constitutive aspect of the making of scientific knowledge. On the shallow view, science is a knowledge-seeking activity that happens to take place in a social world. It assumes that knowledge seeking can be analyzed apart from the social context in which it takes place. And so the question that one might ask is, how does the social context of investigation affect the outcome of inquiry? And researchers in the shallow sociality tradition will give accounts of observation and measurement, of scientific reasoning that are abstracted from whoever it is that actually engages in observation or who engages in reasoning. The default view here is that these constitute activities of an individual who happens to be in a social context. Observation is understood as the exercise of the perceptual capacities of the individual, and reasoning is understood as patterns of thought that are modeled by classical, categorical, and propositional logic, and assessed, evaluated with respect to their models of validity. Also inductive logics, and we could get expansive and talk about relevance logics and so forth, but there are formal ways of representing the reasoning that are abstractable from the context. And for the shallow view, one question is, how are the efforts of individual cognitive agents coordinated to result in knowledge of the phenomena the sciences address? Talk about in epistemology, we talk about testimony and disagreement. In the sciences, division of cognitive labor, the differential distribution of authority and appropriate deference to authority, the possibility of non-epistemic motivations and biases. Sociologists and anthropologists for the last, 40 or 50 years have given us a very different picture of the sciences. What they say is that when one situates observation and reasoning in their real context, these practices don't look like the kinds of practices to which philosophers attribute justificatory import. Scientists select particular experiments. They select particular instruments with which to conduct those experiments. They select particular kinds of specimens, different model organisms, for example, different chemicals, and they employ different measurement technologies. They interpret the observations and experiments and experimental results that they obtain using those tools and methods. They support or critique conjectures or hypotheses. They derive consequences, extend models to new domains, persuade others, and so forth. And there are multiple reasons for the particular choices and decisions that they make. Feasibility, their kind of practical their ability to be put in practice, the potential for application, commercial application or industrial application. Aesthetic values may play a role. Interest from other colleagues plays a role. Interest from potential consumers, the intelligibility to other colleagues, or a resonance with metaphysical or ideological commitments. And there are studies in history, sociology, anthropology of science that multiple studies that show the ways in which such kinds of reasons have played a role in the decisions, selections that researchers make. On the shallow model, these contaminate science and undermine its claims to provide knowledge. But on the deeper or constitutive model, the central elements of the knowledge productive practices of the sciences, observation and reasoning, are themselves social. So there's no observation and reasoning that we can abstract from or extract from the practices that the sociologists have observed. Success as applied to knowledge as content involves the social, and individual interests and motives for particular selections matter less than how the community incorporates the contributions of its members. So the individual contribution is less important than how the community takes it up, whether it accepts it, rejects it, modifies it, and so forth. So I've given two kinds of arguments for this deeper sociality. I've argued that the cognitive practices themselves, observation and reasoning, are social. And then I've also used the underdetermination argument, first brought to general attention by the French physicist and philosopher Pierre Duhem, the underdetermination problem. So yes, okay. I'm just going to race through this section. Observational data consist in observation reports that are ordered and organized. The language of observation, the language in which we record our experimental results, isn't given to us by the results themselves. It is a language that we construct. We come to, through practice and usage, come to have a consensus about what the language means, what its borders are, what the borders of concepts are, what kinds of things count as, say, a sample of gold, a sample of acid, what counts as a gene, which of course, as we know, tends to be many things depending on the particular kinds of genetics we're working on. Okay. So let me just, so what I want to emphasize here is just that the ordering and the organization of our categories, concepts, and classes are social processes. Not just any observation does. Observations have to be stable, they have to be transferable, they have to be repeatable, and so forth, in order to play a role in scientific discourse. And these are social requirements, right? It's not as though an individual can decide, stipulate that this category is transferable as opposed to that. And the satisfaction of these requirements then has to be ascertained through multiple forms of discursive interaction. Okay, and it's survival or modification of a report in response to challenge that enables the transformation from, it seems to me that such and such is the case, to such and such is the case. About reasoning, I want to say that reasoning actually, I want to talk about justificatory as opposed to exploratory reasoning, gets its point in a context of challenge and response. Why is it that I justify a claim that I've made? Because someone has challenged me. This is the context in which reasoning has gotten its point. A challenge is met by the offering of reasons to believe it. And those reasons can then be challenged. We go back and forth and so on. But the point is, justificatory reasoning gets its point, in fact, is has a pragmatically implies a social context. Okay, so the actual cognitive processes, I want to say, are social processes, but also logic leads us to a social account of scientific knowledge as well. There are two ways of thinking about the underdetermination problem. It's the second that I think is the most interesting, namely the issue about the relationship between theory and evidence. And the point here is that there is a gap between our data and the theories, models, and hypotheses that are developed to explain the data. And one of the most dramatic kinds of examples of this is the difference between claims about collisions and disintegrations of elementary particles, which are based on phenomena that can be observed. What is observed? Well, it used to be tracks in compressed gas, but the physicists have moved beyond those now and use detectors that are attached to accelerators that apparently move particles at very, very high speeds so that they can collide with each other and so forth. The result, what gets observed, is a sequence of ciphers, a sequence of numbers on data tapes. And from those numbers, researchers will infer the presence or absence of particles over their collision and so forth. So that gap between what is actually observed as data and the assumptions that data support is crossed by assumptions that establish the relevance of that data to the hypothesis. That requires reliance on substantive, and so ascertaining evidential relevance requires reliance on substantive and methodological background assumptions. These are a function of consensus among the scientific community. They're learned as part of one's apprenticeship as a scientist, and they're largely invisible to practitioners within the community. They constitute the intellectual context of inquiry. They circulate through and are enmeshed in the social context of inquiry. They can be substantive, compositional, what things are made of. They can be processual, about causal relations, or they can be methodological, from general epistemological views to views about the appropriate kinds of data for particular kinds of inquiry. And there are multiple explanations for their persistence. So to the sociologist list that I saw put up before, one could add that assumptions sometimes persist because they are embedded in empirically successful practice. They also persist because of inertia. Nobody has thought to question them. And history. So these are all explanations for why assumptions will persist. And the question then should become, how can a community be assured that the assumptions that play the roles they play are worthy of acceptance? And how can a community be assured that the interactions that constitute its cognitive activity are not a result of coercion by a powerful authority or of tradition that is accepted unthinkingly? Okay, so the answer that comes from thinking of scientific knowledge as constitutively social is that these assumptions have to be subject to criticism at all places where they occur, whether that's in data representation, in observation, or reasoning, which requires reconfiguring justification as including not just observation and logical relations, but critical discursive interaction. And it's that that makes the epistemology deeply social, that the justificatory processes, the processes by which scientific knowledge actually becomes knowledge for the community, are social processes of critical discursive interaction. A full account would have to spell out the conditions for these social interactions. And I've proposed 4, that there be venues for critical interaction, that there be uptake in the community, that the standards of evaluation be public and themselves subject to critique, and that all perspectives must from the outset be accorded a prima facie equality of intellectual authority. So they must be regarded as equally capable of generating criticism. This requires 2 modifications. First of all, because assumptions that are shared by all members of a community, and because they persist even in the face of what appear to be effective critical structures, diversity and dissensus in the community have to be regarded as resources. So consensus is not necessarily a good thing. In many cases, it simply prevents our examination, our critical examination of the work. And with respect to uptake and temperate equality, all perspectives may be regarded at the outset as equally capable of generating criticism. But this view imposes a requirement on them. They have to be sensitive to the responses to their criticism, and failure to adjust in the face of criticism or response is, on their part, a failure of uptake and thus loss of equal status. And I've proposed, and this is not necessary, changing some terms, but that's okay. So this view, I think, is deeply social. It incorporates the social interactions of scientists into the normative scope of epistemology. It's open to pluralist forms of realism. It tempers the role that social values will play in the development of knowledge through the practice of criticism that satisfies the 4 norms that I put up, or other norms that there may be more. Okay, so why bother with this? Well, I think it helps us to think about areas of science where values are involved. I'm just going to talk about health risk research and scientific research on behavior because time. So just quickly say, as some of you may know, this really interesting paper by Heather Douglas that was published in 2000 on inductive risk. And what Douglas kind of painstakingly says, Douglas studied research on the health effects of dioxin. Most of this research, dioxin is a byproduct of the production of paper. Most of this work, what she showed or attempted to show in this paper, I mean, I think she was quite successful, is that very technical decisions in the heart of the research, decisions about what level of statistical significance we are to require, decisions about what dose response model to use, decisions about how to determine borderline, how to adjudicate within borderline cases, what rule are we going to use to put borderline cases on one side, problematic lesion, and on the other side, non-problematic lesion? These are decisions that are hidden deep in the conduct of research and are invisible, really, in the public presentation of the work. But they are decisions that have social consequences, because if you set your level of statistical significance for health effects, deleterious health effects, too high, you will set the regulatory requirements too high. That will have economic results. If you set this level of statistical significance too low, you will, if it's too high, actually, if it's too high, you'll understate the health risks, and if you set them too low, you'll overstate the health risks. Yeah, I always get it backwards when I'm trying to. But anyway, you get the point. There are social consequences to these decisions that are embedded deep in the work. So that raises it. How can the opposing sides, how can the people who are concerned about whether or not to allow the plant to continue as it does, the paper plant, how can they trust the research? And in shallow sociology, we would just emphasize the methodological rigor by which the work was carried out. So yes, we use this. Everything conforms to this level of statistical significance that we've established. The statistics are terrific. Our assignment of borderline cases to this side or the other was clear, and so forth. So that's one thing we could do. But the other thing you could do is actually incorporate representatives of diverse interest groups into the conduct of the research itself, so that these decisions about statistical significance, borderline cases, won't be done in either a thoughtless or kind of unintentional way that has social consequences for the different social consequences for the different communities that are concerned about the plant. Okay, so that's I think one thing to say. I'll talk a little bit, just for a second, about the work I did in studying human behavior. Human behavior is, like climate, a very complex subject that is approached by different methodologies and different disciplines. There's not just one way of trying to study human behavior. There is genetics, of course, but neurophysiology, developmental psychology, various integrative approaches, and a population ecological approach. So these all give different answers to questions about the etiology of specific behavioral patterns, whether we're talking about so-called aggressive behavior or sexual behavior or smoking or drug taking, whatever. But in the world of studying human behavior, there's nothing like the International Panel on Climate Change, which attempts to integrate the results of all the different disciplines that are involved in thinking about the atmosphere. And to some extent, it seems that there's less urgency. We're not all going to burn up in 50 years because of the results of research on human behavior, whereas we are, if we don't do something about the climate. Maybe not 50, but 150. Advocates of one or another of the approaches that I looked at dismiss their alternatives as methodologically unsound. They claim that they have the best methods for getting any kind of causal grip on human behavior. A look at the citation patterns revealed that there was interaction and mutual citation within approaches, but not across approaches, that there was very little interaction among, say, developmental psychologists and geneticists about behavior. This is 2003. 13, I mean, things can always change, which is why I'm hesitant to talk about what is going on today. About this work, I argued that it represents a kind of ineliminable plurality because it presupposes what I called incompatible parsings of the causal landscape. And because you can't reduce all the approaches to one, you can't empirically comparatively evaluate them one against the other, it requires a different kind of scrutiny. It's really tempting to look at just one approach, especially the genetic, and identify its methodological weaknesses. But I think in a way that's partly to mimic the behavior of climate change deniers. And I think a more deeply social perspective might ask, what can be achieved in any of these approaches, what challenges they collectively face, and what their mutual relevance might be, how their results might interact among themselves and with other forces in the social context, that supports the research. A comparative analysis fostered by the social perspective reveals that each approach has partial successes, in spite of none of them being able to offer an answer to the big question: is an aggressive disposition an outcome of possession of a particular genetic configuration or of environmental conditions? This is just a bad question, but it does seem to be the question for many people. A focus on just one approach, I think, exaggerates both its possible success and its possible dangers. And understanding an approach in the context of the variety of competing approaches should prevent panic about inappropriate use and lead to a more nuanced understanding of the possibilities and prospects of this area of science. Okay, well, so that's what I was ready to say in 2013. I think some of this more recent work raises doubts about the adequacy of this kind of an approach. There should be certainly public discourse, but I think there should be discussion of the value of, say, the new genetic research as against the value of other research. And this should take into account not only the overall research context. So when I was thinking some years ago, I was thinking only of the approaches vis-a-vis one another, but I think also the context of the research, the social context in which this research is undertaken. I think that, yeah, and probably there should be a public discussion that includes all interested parties, and the point shouldn't be censorship, but identifying the appropriate ends to which limited resources should be directed. And let me just say here that the work that was cited, that Philippe was talking about earlier, and that was cited by the Buffalo shooter who was citing other people, this work on educational attainment. The authors of this work go to great lengths to distance themselves from the kind of misuse of genetics that was characteristic of genetics and behavior work some decades ago. They have a frequently asked questions section that is 10 times longer than the original paper, in which they point out that the research is on a fairly uniform population, Northern Europeans. So there's nothing about racial difference in the research. What else do they do? They talk about the limitations, how small the actual effect sizes are. They talk about how little of the variance is actually accounted for by the genetic differences. So they do all of this. They do all of this, and still it ends up in a pamphlet or a manifesto supporting racist ideologies. So that, it seems to me, poses a really different problem than the problem posed by, say, Jensen or Bernstein and Murray and other researchers. What else do I want to, do I have anything more useful to say? No. I guess what I want to say is that if we're going to talk about this, we have to recognize the ways in which the work itself might be perfectly good. I mean, I think that there are problems with GWAS overall. I mean, I think it's been said, and not totally inaccurately, that if you conduct a big enough GWAS, you can find a set of SNPs for any trait you want. So, and of course, we're part. I mean, we're material beings. Genes are part of our material being, so of course they're implicated in what we do. But I think what we need to think about is how one effectively counters these misuses, which are misreadings. Even Hartley, or Harden, whatever she's called, misstates in her book the results of her own research. So I think these are the things we have to pay attention to, as well as kind of attending to the methodological issues in the work, because all of that is producing a public knowledge that is deeply flawed. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you.